email. So my name is Rosie and I work within the responsible sourcing team here at Sedex. A key part of my work is looking at how we can apply a gender lens to the development of our tools and services. With me today are three fantastic speakers, each with a great experience of working to improve women's empowerment and working conditions in supply chains. First, we have Clare Fitton. Clare is Monitoring, Evaluation and Learning Advisor at the ETI and Project Manager of the ETI's Gender Programme. She has a background in human rights law and over 10 years' experience in corporate social responsibility. Then we have Victoria Reca. Victoria is Manager in BSR's Women's Empowerment Practice and works with the private sector to advance gender equality efforts through consulting, collaboration and research. Victoria has a strong focus on mainstreaming gender equality across supply chain management systems and due diligence processes. And we have Jo Webb. Jo is an ethical trade professional with over 15 years' experience in supply chain sustainability, risk assessment, capacity building, and stakeholder engagement across a range of sectors. So what can you expect to hear about today? We'll start with Clare from the ETI, who will talk to us about the kinds of risks and issues women can face in supply chains and the importance of integrating gender within due diligence programs. Then Victoria from BSR will take us through a set of indicators that you can use to measure and track women's situations in your business and supply chains. Then Jo from The Body Shop will talk to us about how she monitors gender risks within her role and some practical tips on how to get started with gender data. I'll end by talking about the tools available at Sedex that can help you understand gender-related risks in your supply chain, and we'll finish with Q&A. Each speaker will talk for around 10 minutes, and we should have time to address some of the questions at the end. So to set the scene before we get to our speakers, we're going to start with a video created by BSR that goes through some of the issues that women face in supply chains and the proactive steps your business can take to address them.
Great, so I'll pick up from there. Hello, I'm Clare Fitton. I'm the Monitoring, Evaluation and Learning Advisor and also the Gender Program Manager for the ETI. For those that don't know the ETI, the Ethical Trading Initiative, we are a membership organisation made up of companies, trade unions and NGOs who all work together to promote workers' rights around the globe, so working in global supply chains. We've always had a very close relationship with Sedex, so I'm very thrilled to be invited to speak today. So thank you very much to Rosie and to Sedex for that invitation. Next slide, please. So the ETI is founded on the ETI base code. These are a set of principles that are all based on ILO conventions and is an internationally recognized code of labor practice. These are the 9 principles in front of you here. They include things like employment is freely chosen, no discrimination, regular employment, and no child labor. So where does gender sit within the ETI base code? It is often placed in no discrimination. It's a very easy and obvious place to see where it fits. But actually, gender risks and problems in your supply chain actually cut across all these different areas. There are risks to women in all of these. They are treated differently. There are obvious areas and less obvious areas. If we move on to the next slide, I've compiled a few examples cut across the base code to see where you might find risks that you might not be looking for. But if we take the first base code item, which is that employment is freely chosen, 71% of all the people who are currently thought to be in modern day slavery are women. So already we have a gendered risk inside a base code issue. Other examples, child labor. Within the last year, numbers have risen. For the first time in 20 years, we've seen a rise in child labor during the COVID-19 crisis. And within that, we've seen an increase, not just in the rise of child labor officially done by girls, but they are taking on responsibilities and additional work responsibilities and care and domestic duties of sick and looking after the household as well. So there are unseen child labor risks as well for girls. We see women are the majority percentage in many sectors which are dominated by casual and insecure labor. So they are denied access to constant and regular employment. So these include areas like care and cleaning and retail, but there are many others. And if we move on to the next slide, we see if we take base code number 3, which is working conditions are safe and hygienic. During the COVID-19 crisis, just in Leicester and other British manufacturing garment manufacturers, we have seen that women are 4 times more likely to die from COVID-19 than the average woman worker. So we see a greater risk in the occupational health and safety supply chains. If we move on, we see that the global gender gap has increased by a generation. Sorry, we're still on the last slide, I'm sorry. In the last year, from 99.5 years to 135.6 years is what is now considered the time it will take for the global gender gap to close. So we are further away from equal pay. And we have seen a rise in sexual violence and harassment against women, including risks such as sexual favors being demanded for workers in order to return to work where there are jobs that are few and far between. We have seen a rise in domestic violence as workers are furloughed or at home and in uncomfortable positions. We have seen this globally and across many different supply chains, not just the agricultural sector. So the impacts of COVID have also increased and worsened the already multitude of risks to women workers. If we can move on to the next slide. I am also here to say that it is not all bad news, because you are in a position to make a difference and to impact women workers across your supply chains in an extraordinary extent. If you undertake gender sensitive due diligence, you will see a benefit not just to workers, where you might assess some of these risks I have mentioned and make changes that can impact there, but you will also see benefits to your own business. We have seen it across many businesses that we work with, and in studies undertaken, we're seeing production quality and output increase. For example, a training program for female coffee workers in Indonesia has resulted in productivity increasing by 131%. So there are tangible benefits to doing this work. We have seen improved retention rates and reduced absenteeism. For example, a garment factory in Vietnam, which provided kindergarten for workers' children, this resulted in a staff turnover fall of a third. And we have seen better financial returns for businesses. So a study spanning 3,000 companies showed that between 2012 and 2014, large companies with at least one woman on the board outperformed companies with no women on the board by 5%. So we see that empowering and promoting women has financial benefits as well for your organization. Next slide, please. So the ETI has produced 2 gender equality guidance documents, one based on the base code, which covers the risks that I have already mentioned and the business case for undertaking gender sensitive due diligence. And the second one is a guidance on how to undertake gender sensitive due diligence. So this is based on ETI's human rights due diligence framework. So we look at how to undertake a gender sensitive lens in each area of your due diligence from the start, from assessing your risks right through identifying your leverage and what actions to take, to how to remediate workers, and then also how to monitor and improve your actions year to year. So within all of those, we have built in ways and methodologies for how you can incorporate a gender lens. Next slide, please. So to get started, to give you a few practical suggestions for getting started, we suggest undertaking a gender assessment of your supply chain. So starting by looking at your key supply chain countries and their progress towards gender equality. So whether they are signatories to treaties, whether they have ratified certain conventions, what legal necessities you will be required to undertake if you are within that country, and how far along they are. This will also give you a guide as to where some of the risks might be by seeing some of the areas that they have not signed up to. And then assessing potential and actual risks. So looking at the research that is done, there's plenty done by ETI, by BSR, who are on the call today, by many other NGOs and international organizations, to look at what risks you should be looking out for, what are the potentials that could be there in your supply chain, and then focusing on the areas where you have the greatest leverage. So looking for places where you can potentially make the most difference as the best place to start. We then recommend gathering basic data. So you need to know very basic data on which categories of workers are in your supply chain, so you can narrow down what risks might be relevant to you. I know this is going to come up a lot in this discussion, and this is where we advise starting wholeheartedly. So I'm very much looking forward to BSR's discussion in a moment. And then we suggest looking at what existing efforts and initiatives are being undertaken in this chosen supply chain area. So you're not duplicating efforts where things have already been undertaken and have been successful. You can learn from these and implement them yourselves, or you can join in existing initiatives and add your weight and leverage to them. And then when you are undertaking social auditing, to ensure that it is carried out by auditors who are qualified and suitable to undertake gender sensitive auditing. So women auditors who are able to understand the risks and gain the trust of women workers in a quicker and easier way are often advised, but it is also the questions that you ask and the methodologies. We have advice on this as well. So I think that's it from me, and I'm about to hand over to Victoria Reca from BSR to continue with this discussion. Many thanks.
Thank you so much, Claire. So good morning, good afternoon, if there's anyone on the afternoon. I'm Victoria Reca, and I am a manager at BSR's Women's Empowerment Practice. And for those of you who are not familiar with BSR, we are a global nonprofit organization that works with our member companies and other partners on sustainability issues. We have a global footprint and work across multiple industries, and issues include climate change, human rights, sustainability management, diversity, equity and inclusion, and then of course women's empowerment. So we work with the Sedex a lot on how do we continue to mainstream gender in supply chain initiatives and certification bodies. So now we can go to the next slide. Before we dive into more practical guidances and tools and around collecting and monitoring gender data, I wanted to quickly review the gender challenges that may exist across supply chains that may often go unnoticed and unseen because we're not necessarily integrating a gender dimension to how we are looking at these issues. And a number of these Claire has already mentioned, so I'm not going to dive into them all. But to start, it's really important to understand that women workers' rights in global supply chains are affected across different fronts. And this is due to stereotypes, to social norms, to legal frameworks, the working environment itself, among others. And the combination of a few of these often lead to discrimination against women or practices that do not consider women's specific needs. So as you can see here, we have things such as access information, which is really around women's education, women's ability to really be able to voice their concerns, women's ability to make well-informed decisions, and how does this impact their working environment and working opportunities and experiences. We have issues around economic opportunities, which are very linked to what Claire was saying around contract types, pay, and the stability that they can have in the workplace. We have issues around leadership and representation. Often, there's a very big and evident gap when it comes to vertical segregation in the workplace as to where are women situated and where are they not, where are they present and where they're not, what are the opportunities do they have for professional development and promotion. And the fact actually that there's limited women in leadership position often means there's less representation in women across decision-making bodies in the organizations, and this may contribute to perpetuate this gap. We see gender-based violence, which was evident also in the video, which creates more hostile working environments for women, and this also can limit the type of works they can have, the hours they can be working, and so on. When it comes to health and safety, we see job and task segregation, which is very present in global supply chains, and women-specific biological health needs, right? So this means that women and men are generally exposed to different working health and safety risks, but however, these often go overlooked and unseen. And finally, of course, we have care responsibilities and sexual reproductive health and rights impacts, right? So the role that women have in the household really is impacting not only their working hours and working days, as they're often taking a heavy load of unpaid care. That means that they're having longer work days when it comes to clubbing paid and unpaid work, but also the responsibilities that they have in the household often need that they need to take more informal working conditions, as they cannot really commit to formal working contracts and conditions. So basically, these are just a set of challenges that we've seen across our work. But however, the lack of gender disaggregated data and gender blind indicators often leaves us blind to these gender specific issues, both brands and suppliers. So when suppliers are not really collecting and analyzing gender disaggregated data, we're just contributing to rendering these issues invisible from management systems, right? And when management is unaware of gendered issues, they may be designing unconsciously, gender blind policies and programs which are failing to address women workers' needs and may be even harming women. And this negative cycle is hard to break unless we are really starting to look at data. But thankfully, we are seeing a growing trend on requiring collection and analysis of gender disaggregated data for companies such as, the UN Gender Dimensions to the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and all of these guidances that different initiatives are putting forward, as Claire was mentioning. So if we go to the next slide, at BSR, we identified that a systemic approach to define and measure gender indicator was needed in order to be able to monitor progress across global supply chains, to guide decisions and future investments. And this is how we developed the gender responsive due diligence guidance, which is basically what you're seeing here on the screen, and you can also access it online. But basically, to do this, BSR worked with the ICO Gender Working Group, multi-stakeholder consultations. We piloted data collection in 10 factories to come up with this framework to really guide companies on how to assess gender disaggregated data, how to integrate and act upon this data, and how to track and communicate the approach and progress. Within this framework, there's a number of set of indicators that I'll briefly touch base on today because it's very exhaustive, but they do cover the key areas of women's empowerment that we were just speaking about right now. And a set of recommendations for brands and suppliers on how to conduct root cause analysis and how to design an effective action plan. That is clubbed together with this Excel tool, which is really to help you just collect and plug in the information and really start to analyze and get your hands on what to do next as you see what the evidence is showing. So when you go to the next slide, I'll just quickly walk you through the type of indicators you can find here and why we think these are important. So the guidance provides a number of detailed suggestions on how to conduct gender responsive due diligence. So for example, Claire was just talking about country, understanding the country. So here we have provided, what kind of indexes and global indicators can we be looking at to at least understand the status of gender equality in that country. But I'd like to focus on now on specifically the indicators, which there's quite a few. I'll show them right after, but they're clubbed in these two broader pillars which you're seeing here, which are the workforce indicators and the worker impact indicators. So when we look at the workforce indicators, we really want to understand like a general profile of the workforce and the performance, right? So this is data that should be collected easily through document review of suppliers. And when we're looking at this, we're looking at on one hand performance indicators. So we propose to assess whether gender could be a defining factor of workforce dynamics that are impacting the supplier performance. So for example, absenteeism, is there a gap in when we look at absenteeism, at turnover, at productivity? If we look at that disaggregated by gender, is there anything that we can analyze from that, for example, on absenteeism or on turnover? And then we have workforce profile data, which is really to understand, and Claire was referring to this right before, the gender composition of the workforce along different dimensions, such as contract types, job distribution, the hierarchy of the company, wages, and potentially other vulnerability factors. And this can help capture just potential gaps that can be showing evidence of different working opportunities and conditions for women versus men. And on the other hand, the second set of indicators are the worker impact indicators, which seek to provide an overview of worker outcomes and experiences in the workplace, of course, as well disaggregated by gender. So when we're looking at the outcome indicators, we want to evaluate whether factories, policies, practices, and workplace culture are really achieving positive outcomes for women workers, or are they really harming them? So for example, are women being promoted? Are women voicing their concerns? Things like that is what we're proposing with the workplace outcomes. When we look at perceptions and behaviors, we want to assess how the individual workers perceive and behave in the workplace, and understand whether the policies, practices, and culture are effectively providing enabling environment for women workers. And then on the end, and lastly, we have the social norms, which assess to which aim to assess the opinions of the group in general, to see whether social norms are conducive to advancing gender equality or are contributing to perpetuating certain inequalities. With that said, the idea is really to have all of this information disaggregated by data and be able to compare what are the outcomes and the perceptions that workers are seeing, and is there any difference between the perceptions of women and the perceptions of men. And as I was saying, these are segmented into different issues that we covered just before. So if we go to the next slide, I don't want to overwhelm with this slide, but basically these are the indicators that we are putting forward, and I'll make sure that we can circulate the guidance so you can take a closer look. But as Claire was saying, if we need to get started, really the blue indicators when we're looking at, the workforce profile indicators, this is really something we need to have for sure. Really understand if there's anything that's very systemic in the organization when it comes to performance and workforce profile that we need to be assessing. And then the other set is really when we start to engage with workers. How are they feeling in the workplace, and how do we contribute and help to make a more enabling environment for both women and men workers. So with that in mind, I'm just gonna switch it over to Jo from the Body Shop.
Fantastic, thanks Victoria, and thanks Claire as well. So a lot of the points that Claire and Victoria have raised are ones that that I'm going to address from perhaps a more practical perspective. So why you should focus on gender, getting started, some practical tips, obviously some challenges and some positive impact as well that you can gain from this, as Claire also mentioned. So next slide please, Rosie. So why focus on gender? Now, I mean, obviously for the Body Shop, we're a feminist brand with operations, retail stores, supply chains, and a consumer base that are heavily female dominated. And female empowerment is a key issue for us here at the Body Shop. We're a brand that fights for female empowerment globally, and fighting for equality is in our DNA. However, all organisations should be thinking about this issue. I think another few reasons: if you don't understand the difference between gendered and non-gendered issues, if you don't have gendered disaggregated data, you don't really know which problem to solve. And I think that's exactly the same point that Victoria was making. If you saw non-compliances just at a wage level, you don't actually know whether you're dealing with a wages issue, or actually if that is a low wages for women issue. And the same with worker turnover. If you only have a worker turnover figure in general, you don't know whether actually it's all the women leaving, or actually it's just a more generic issue. So understanding the difference between gendered and non-gendered data issues is really important, and that's one of the reasons why we and other brands had worked with Sedex to form the gender working group that's helped to create the gender data reports that we can now use. Another reason is for us, in terms of our human rights due diligence approach, it's about focusing on the most vulnerable. And I won't repeat what Claire has said, but I think Claire's and the ETI presentation really showed how women are quite often the most vulnerable within supply chains. Also, legal, financial, reputational risk, these are all key things in terms of, the everyday job of business. It's not just about doing the right thing, but actually from gender pay gap reporting to modern slavery reporting to forthcoming mandatory human rights due diligence, having more of this information at a gendered level is going to be really important. And of course, it's been shown that businesses that address non-financial risks in their supply chain actually are more resilient in the longer term. And of course, it gives you the opportunity to drive positive impact, which I'll come on to later. So next slide, please. So how do you get started? Well, again, the first thing really is to make sure your own house is in order. We wouldn't ask our suppliers to do anything that we're not doing ourselves. So at the Body Shop, we strive to try to ensure that we have a diverse workforce. We pay a real living wage to all of our staff in store and distribution centres, and that's permanent and on-site agency staff from the first day that they start working with us. We have policies, including things like carers leave, shared parental leave, and we've got a number of internal networks such as gender networks, LGBT+ networks, mental health first aider networks. So there's a number of forums to ensure that we can surface information within our own business. But then once you move on to working with suppliers, it's really about just starting at a general supply chain transparency perspective, making sure that we communicate our expectations, that we take a human rights due diligence approach, that we're monitoring issues, we're remediating them and training, providing capacity building where we see common issues occurring, and then making sure that we're embedding this into the way that we do business. But of course, that takes a general overview. And when we need to then put a gender lens on top of this, then there are, and I've shown on the next slide, how you can think about trying to pivot to integrating a gender approach. So for example, in our supplier code of conduct, we have a supplier code of conduct. Can you consider not just non-discrimination generally, but actually are there specific gender related clauses that you can be included, that you can include? In the supply chain mapping, obviously that's what we're talking about today. You know, that helps us to understand what we buy and where we buy it from. And the gender disaggregated data element helps us to understand in much more detail where we can focus. And as was already mentioned about a human rights assessment, Claire mentioned about gender sensitive due diligence, as did Victoria. So, you know, trying to look at the gender lens to your human rights assessments. And then when you do active investigations, again, what are the mechanisms that you can use to make sure that you're taking a gender focus, perhaps on those areas where you can see that there's more vulnerability. So is that about worker voice pilots? Is it about doing more participatory audits, more women-led audits, you know, making sure things like you do have a female audit team. So all of those sorts of considerations need to come into play. And then I think activism and advocacy and being transparent are just things that we also as an activist brand think that it's part of our role as well to try and raise awareness, not just in supply chains, but with our consumer base as well. So next slide, please, Rosie. So of course there are challenges. So obviously one of the first is the data collection. You really need to start with just mapping your supply chain first, and that's not an easy task. So actually being able to integrate gender data into that process at the same time as you're mapping the supply chain is really helpful. It does require effort from companies themselves and from your suppliers because of supplier churn, the effort required. So, you know, it is important to make sure that the effort's put into that. Visibility beyond the first tier. So of course, as we move deeper into our supply chains and beyond tier one, it becomes more challenging, especially as we know that often severe human rights abuses are often deeper within supply chains. So of course that is something that starts to become more difficult. But for us at the Body Shop, as well as having the responsible procurement and ethical trade program, which works top down, we're also very fortunate that we have our own community fair trade program, which is our Body Shop bespoke fair trade program, working directly with vulnerable and disadvantaged communities at farm and producer level. And actually, for many years, we've been conducting an annual census of our community fair trade partners that includes, amongst other things, gender disaggregated data. So that gives visibility of where men and women feature in our supply chains, for example, number of seasonal farmers or permanent factory supervisors, and then it allows us to work with those partners specifically to develop policies and practices. We've already talked, I won't perhaps spend too much time in the interest of time on human rights due diligence and integrating gender, but as has already been mentioned, some of the mainstream social audits take more of a non-discrimination approach. So it's to think about different ways to integrate a gender lens into that. And I think the final part is around leverage. I think another key challenge for many companies, especially if you start to think about commodity supply chains, it's very difficult to get visibility down to farm or producer levels. So for example, palm is a key ingredient to the Body Shop. It's present in hundreds of different cosmetics and food products, but it's also an ingredient that's been linked to environmental and societal problems such as deforestation, sexual harassment, forced labour. So that's where something like working with a multi-stakeholder initiative, such as the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, or others depending on the industry, really helps where an individual brand has very little leverage. And final slide, please, Rosie. And I think the final thing I really wanted to highlight was the opportunity for positive impact. So there's just a few examples here of ways that we are working to drive positive impact, whether it's on payment of real living wages, whether it's our community fair trade programme, whether it's working with the UK government on the Working Opportunities for Women programme, or whether it's actually using our platform as an activist brand. So example here of a global domestic violence awareness raising programme, but others where we can use our brand to drive more awareness and activism. So I will leave it there and I will hand back now to Rosie.
Thank you, Jo. So we've heard about why it's important to integrate gender within your responsible sourcing strategy, what indicators you need to focus on, and how to get started. So now I'm just going to talk you through a few tools available at Sedex that you can use to gather and analyse data about women in your supply chain. Improving gender data collection and accessibility is a key focus area for Sedex, as we believe in the value of this data to drive action and progress, not only for women's empowerment, but also for conditions for all workers working in supply chains. So this slide gives an overview of the tools available through Sedex. If we start with the site profile and SAQ, these are one of the first things that suppliers complete when they join Sedex and are your first step to collecting information about your supply chain to help with the supply chain mapping exercise. A number of questions are aligned with the data points from the BSR framework. So through these tools, you can find out about the numbers of men and women working in your supply chain and the types of positions they're in. And then this information feeds through into a risk assessment tool called Radar. And Radar uses independent data indicators to allocate risk scores. And these scores are broken down by topic, so you can see which countries, sectors and suppliers have higher gender risks, helping you to see where you might want to focus first. And then we have SMETA, which stands for the Sedex Members Ethical Trade Audit, which is used by third-party auditors to assess compliance against the ETI base code and local law. Auditors can highlight a number of issues relevant to gender, such as if there's discrimination in hiring or promotions. This information can then be accessed through our reporting tools. So the reports that are available within the reporting tools can help you to manage compliance programs, analyze trends in the data, and see if there are any particular areas of concern. One of the reports that we'll have available soon is the Gender Data Report. And finally, we have an e-learning section where you can access guidance on gender data and a training video developed by BSR on how to conduct gender-sensitive factory assessments. So just to briefly show you before we move to questions in the last few minutes, this is a screenshot of the Gender Data Report, which pulls together information from the SAQ, site profiles and audits. It shows you the gender breakdown of workforces across your supply chain presented on a map and gives statistics across key gender data indicators, which are aligned with BSR, such as the percentage of women in management positions or the gender breakdown of men and women on worker committees. I just want to highlight here that making the data points available is the first step, and we've heard today that access to gender data is a big challenge. So it's really important to work across your business and your suppliers to understand where the gender gaps are and encourage data collection for the indicators that are most important to you. So thank you for listening to this webinar. We're going to use the last few minutes to answer a few questions which have been put forward. So if we start with a great question that's come in, which is asking about how a business looking to understand not just gender data, but supply chain data in general, how can they get started? So what's the first step that you want to take? And from a Sedex point of view, joining a data sharing platform like Sedex enables your business to start mapping your supply chain, collecting data from your suppliers and identify potential risks. But if I direct this question to Jo as a Sedex member. What is the first step that you would recommend to your business for getting started with supply chain data?
Yeah, of course, happy to answer that. I think perhaps I touched on it a little bit within my presentation, that actually make sure you've got your own house in order first before you're actually asking suppliers to do something, so it's not disingenuous. But really, I think it starts with understanding what you buy and who you buy it from. And if that's too big a task to start with, then actually undertaking a bit of a risk assessment. Many companies might start with a phased approach. So for us, for example, if we're retailing products, then we'll start with the suppliers that manufacture those products for us, so the consumer facing elements. And some companies might decide to break that up into chunks, perhaps by category, or perhaps by a risk assessment at a country level, first of all, before moving on to second tier, or perhaps even indirect suppliers of, if logistics, moving product around, is a big part of your business, you might want to prioritize that sector. So that's probably where I'd start. Start with actually understanding what you buy, who you buy it from, what spend you have with those companies, with those suppliers, sorry, and then start to give yourself a phased and prioritized action plan of who to address and who to onboard and who to map in which order.
Great, thank you, Jo. I think we have time for just one more question. I'd like to direct this one at Clare from the ETI. So Clare, do you think that the upcoming EU mandatory human rights due diligence laws will encourage companies to monitor gender data more effectively?
That's a great question. I mean, the hopeful answer is yes, in as much as the legislation should ensure that more companies are performing due diligence and performing it better. There'll be more proliferation of advice and guidance and better understanding of what due diligence actually means. So that is the kind of hopeful answer. The other side is that without commitment at a company level, gender will always get sidelined or kind of squished into an area rather kind of than holistically embodied across all due diligence processes. So it does take commitment from companies and internal dialogue, and as Jo has said, starting with yourselves, looking internally to really make it meaningful and worthwhile. So we at ETI and other organizations are lobbying for inclusion of gender within the EU legislation and the guidelines that go along with it, but it will definitely take businesses' commitment to pick this up.
Great, thank you, Clare. So we've come to the end of our time today, and I'd like to thank all our speakers for sharing their insights, and to everyone who's attended for giving your time to join us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.